Since conflicts are unavoidable, it is important to have the capability to resolve them. This is a critical management skill. As a leader, you can develop a broader organizational culture conducive to productive conflict and intolerance of destructive conflict. But any leader will nonetheless need to develop their conflict management ability in order to address these issues when they inevitably arise. This is a critically important competency because failure to manage conflict can place a number of significant team and organizational outcomes at risk. Legally, many countries legislate against organizations that fail to provide a safe workplace environment free from bullying, harassment, and other forms of employee mistreatment. Governments may intervene or impose financial penalties on organizations, and sometimes even supervisors, who fail to protect their employees. Financially, workplace mistreatment and bullying can be a significant cost to the economy through employee absences, medical costs, and any other benefits provided to people with poor mental health. In a relatively small economy like Australia, workplace bullying has been estimated to cost organizations as much as $38 billion per year. But even for the team itself, feeling mistreated reduces physical and psychological health and leads to work disengagement. Moreover, it significantly undermines the team dynamic by reducing the interpersonal trust required for effective cooperation, coordination, and communication. Even seemingly minor conflicts can harm both team productivity and individual well-being. Conflict is in the eye of the beholder. So even if a conflict does not meet your definition of being problematic, if another party feels harmed or unfairly treated, it is likely to affect team outcomes. Inherent in dealing with conflict are some traps that leaders need to be aware of. People have a natural human tendency to avoid confrontations, and for many leaders, the hardest part of dealing with conflict is to address it head-on. Another easy trap to fall into is assuming that one person is right and the other person is wrong. When it comes to task or process conflicts, oftentimes both parties have a legitimate claim. And because of that, the best solution is often the one that makes both parties happy, the proverbial win-win solution. When it comes to relationship conflicts, it is usually ego and emotions at stake. They are not upset because of any particular decision or outcome, but rather because they feel harmed or disrespected in some way. So, if both parties are willing to concede respect and value the opinion of the other party, oftentimes both people can eventually walk away feeling satisfied. There are a variety of frameworks for conflict management, depicting different styles. However, most of them position these various approaches along two key dimensions, representing concern for self versus concern for other. If a party has high concern for their own outcomes and low consideration for the outcomes of the other party, they are likely to adopt a dominating approach to the conflict. They believe they are right and have a personal interest at stake, so they dig their heels in. They attempt to resolve the situation by winning. They argue their case, put down the other person's case, and try to get third parties on side. They may use their power or coercion to get their way. However, it is also common to have parties take an avoiding approach. On the surface, this appears to be effective because the conflict does not escalate. However, it doesn't mean the conflict has been resolved. Feelings of upset may fester under the surface, affecting future team interactions. People that avoid conflicts are generally disengaged from the team. They prioritize harmony over either party's position, and thus would prefer to avoid the confrontation than try to resolve it. You also see cases where people resolve conflicts by giving in, yielding, or obliging the other party. Often employees will concede to their supervisors, avoiding the political risks of pushing their own agenda. Instead, they sacrifice their concern for the self in the interest of their concern for the other party. In this case, making sure their supervisor is happy. Reasonable people with a moderate concern for their own outcomes and the other person's outcomes will be able to find a suitable compromise, a middle ground that gets both parties halfway there. However, those with high concern for their own outcomes and the outcomes of the other party are unwilling to accept a resolution that requires a concession. Instead, they seek out a cooperative or integrative solution to the conflict. This is the win-win solution. Although an integrative approach is often held in highest conflict management esteem, it is not ideal when time is short, the issues are not important, or the other party is actually wrong. Each style has its time and place. So, just like a good leader can adapt their leadership style, a good conflict manager is able to read the situation correctly and adopt a style that meets the needs of the context. Practically speaking, there are two main challenges to taking an integrative cooperative approach. The first is checking your own emotions and adopting legitimate concern for the other party's perspective on the conflict. To do this will require uncovering the real interests underlying their position. Why are they so upset? What are they really after? If you are able to identify and address that underlying interest, you may discover that it is not in direct opposition to your own interests. To achieve this, make sure you listen. Sounds simple, but hard to do in the heat of a conflict. Listen for understanding. Try to get in their head to discover the root cause of their position. Search for hidden fears. Often a seemingly irrational position is actually due to some insecurity. If you can identify and empathize with that insecurity, it may be more easily managed. Focus on issues, not people. Difficult behavior is not usually driven by a desire to be difficult, but rather incompatible interests. Try not to take it personally, and try not to attribute the conflict to the person. The second challenge is to encourage the other party to adopt concern for your perspective. Cooperating is only an effective strategy if the other party is willing to cooperate as well. Start by framing the discussion as a problem to be understood and resolved. Taking a problem-solving or investigative approach to the conflict helps approach it objectively and place emotions on the sideline. Set a cooperative tone. Make it clear to the other person that you want to help resolve their concerns, and that you wish to work together to find a solution that is satisfactory to everyone. Try reframing the problem to look at the bigger picture. Are there shared long-term goals that you can agree on? Does the conflict undermine those shared goals? If so, you can raise those issues in order to motivate a need for a resolution. For example, we all want this project to be successful, right? Let's try to resolve this dispute so that we don't let the team down. Again, listen. Listening is not only great for getting useful information about the other party's interests and perspective, but it also provides a subtle signal to the other party that you are open to cooperation and compromise. Explain your own experience on the conflict. What does it look like from your perspective? If appropriate for the situation, you might also express your emotions verbally. Don't let your emotions control you, but explain that you are having them. Sometimes this can help the other party to empathize with you and see how you have experienced the conflict differently than they have. Generally speaking, all of these practical suggestions tap into two key elements for resolving conflict through dialogue: getting the other party to see the conflict from your perspective, and acting in a way that shows the other person that you are willing to seek out a way to resolve the conflict cooperatively. Now, it is noteworthy that I have framed these suggestions from the perspective of somebody actively engaged in the conflict. Most of these principles still apply from the perspective of a third party attempting to intervene. So, resolving the conflict means getting each party to see the conflict from the other party's perspective, and to proactively engage in behavior that promotes a cooperative resolution. However, it is also valuable to recognize that by intervening, you are becoming an active participant in that conflict. When a leader gets involved, your own views, assumptions, and interests are suddenly part of the conflict dynamic, and they are likely to shape your interpretations of the situation, even if you are trying to remain objective. Leaders have a tendency to think about how the conflict is harming the organization or the team. As a result, they often focus on solving the outcomes of the problem and putting in place organizational systems and structures that will prevent similar problems in the future. Leaders can easily overlook the fact that individual emotions and reputations are at stake, neglecting the needs of the individuals most directly affected by the conflict. In other words, leaders must also be aware of their own biases and interests in the conflict. And if the involved parties sense that your intervention is one-sided or driven by your own interests rather than coming from sincere concern for their circumstance, it may be better to seek out a neutral third party to mediate any difficult conversations. So, in the resolution of many organizational conflicts, There are at least 3 perspectives being represented: the 2 involved parties, plus an organizational representative like the team leader. Each of these parties tend to prioritize their own interests, and thus seek a resolution that will meet their own needs of the situation. But of course, these interests are usually not aligned, resulting in conflict. Using some of the techniques covered earlier, a resolution is more likely if these different parties are able to take the other party's perspective and exhibit their commitment to finding a cooperative solution that tries to address multiple parties' interests. If the involved parties engage in this reciprocal cooperation, it is more likely that negative emotions will be diffused, an integrated solution can be found, trust will be repaired, and the aggrieved parties will be willing to forgive and try to move on from the conflict. It is also important to recognize that there will be many situations where you cannot give the parties what they want. In these situations where one or more parties is likely to be unhappy with the final outcome, procedural and interactional fairness become particularly important. Procedural fairness refers to the process used to make a decision. Were the affected parties consulted? Is the decision consistent with past decisions? Was there decision-maker bias? Interactional fairness refers to how individuals are treated in that process. Was respect shown for their position? Was adequate information provided? When employees are not satisfied with an outcome or a decision, procedural and interactional fairness help to buffer the negative impact of that outcome. Making decisions with fairness principles in mind helps to reduce the likelihood that employees will feel aggrieved by your actions, protecting you from becoming the target of anger and conflict. Research shows that these fairness judgments are tied to leadership legitimacy, trust in the leader, and employee willingness to voluntarily follow leadership directives. Using these principles within conflict management can help to increase the likelihood that employees will accept the ultimate resolution, even if it requires sacrificing their interests. Resolving conflict fairly lets employees know that you value them and their input into the team, even if you cannot always support their position. As a leader, you are also likely to encounter some of the more severe cases, where conflict crosses over into aggression, abuse, harassment, bullying, or other forms of victimization. Each of these different types of workplace transgressions have their own definition and nuances for their resolution, including the need for reporting and involvement of your human resources staff. However, the principles for effective interpersonal resolution of those conflicts are similar. While your human resources team can help to address employee health and safety and to cover the legal reporting requirements of any serious conflicts, it is your responsibility as a leader to step up and help find a pathway to reconciliation. Failing to do this likely means losing the organization's investment in development of those individual team members, and losing the cooperative team dynamic that you have worked so hard to establish.